Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small. And Dunn trains engagement staff, volunteers, leaders and organisers in leadership and power building. And if you want to create change in your community, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel daunting. And that's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. They're here to help you when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates planning. As Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with the experience that you can count on. And to find out more, just go to their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community both online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, you can go to their website, swiftfoxcrm.com, to win your next campaign. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast. It's out every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns and issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And apologies, we didn't get an episode out last week. Just a couple of things in terms of our scheduling fell through, and we got caught out, which is always annoying. But it just means that we're probably going to drop 2 episodes in the 1 week in a couple of weeks' time, just because we'll have a backlog. But we do apologise for not getting an episode out last week. We always do endeavour to try and drop an episode every Friday. Today's episode, though, is I'm talking to a good friend and colleague of mine named Ashraf Hazmah. Ashraf is I guess he's the head teaching fellow with Marshall Ganz, who is a former community organiser, or is a community organiser, and is a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and takes a number of classes for students that enroll at the Kennedy School. One of them being Leadership, Organising and Action, which is a course designed to train and support community organisers around the globe. And Ashraf Hazmah has been leading that course as the head TF for a number of years. I was a teaching fellow for the class this year for the start in this first semester. So for 6 months, Ashraf was essentially my boss. And he's also got a really interesting backstory. Originally comes from Syria, and I just wanted to get Ashraf on the program today, really to talk a bit about his life growing up in Syria, what it was like during the pro-democracy movement that kicked off around the time of the Arab Spring movement throughout the Middle East, and then led into the tragic circumstances that was the Syrian civil war, that over 600,000 people lost their lives. And we're going to be talking to Ashraf a bit about that experience, but also we're going to be talking a bit about organising and the work that he does as the head teaching fellow at the Kennedy School, as well as a bit about the course as well. Hope you enjoy today's episode. Don't forget that we want you to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favourite podcasts. And if you like the show, give us 5 stars and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Podchaser. And for all the latest updates, follow Dunn on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday evening on Gadigal lands. I'm up in Sydney at the moment. But joining me, I guess on the line from the lands of my own people, he's based in Scotland. He's been leading the teaching team with Marshall Ganz, who you've heard me mention that name on numerous occasions if you've been listening to the podcast over the years. He's been leading the teaching team with Marshall for the Leadership, Organising and Action class at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. For the last 6 months, I called him my boss. Ashraf Hazmah, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
I know that we talked about beforehand, going, how do we introduce you? And I actually thought about going, he's just basically been my boss and someone I've been meeting at random times in the middle of the night on Zoom over the course of the last 6 months. And that's probably the best way to describe the relationship that you and I have. But that wouldn't do you justice to the work that you actually do.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a tricky one, I think, in the sense that it's almost half of my life during the year, but then the other half is a completely different thing. I think I've got the same challenge when people ask me, "What do you do for life? What do you do for work?" And I always have to explain to them to say, "Oh, I've got a 9 to 5 job that I do, but then every 6 months for the past few years, I do this different work in addition to my job. So I end up doing lots of hours. But it's a friend a few years ago said, a job for the heart and a job for put the food on the table. So I guess that's how I see it.
That's actually an excellent explanation, because that's obviously being a teaching fellow under your tutelage this year. That's mentally how I thought about it as well. I wasn't doing it for the money. I was more doing it for the heart. We're going to talk more about that later. Your role as the head teaching fellow for the Leadership, Organising and Action class. But before we do that, I kind of wanted to sort of ground the conversation a bit about what led you to this work. Now, folks listening to this episode, particularly some of my family in Scotland, will note that you don't have a very good Scottish accent, so you're clearly not from Scotland. So your story probably starts somewhere else. Where does the story for Ashraf begin?
That's a good question. I was born and raised in a small town called Sueda in the south of Syria. And that's basically where I grew up all up until 2013. As you might know, 2011 is the uprising started in Syria, the pro-democracy demonstrations, which unfortunately turned later on into more of a civil war and a proxy war in Syria. But up until 2013, I was still living in Syria. Before basically moving out. But yeah, that's where I grew up, and that's where I got introduced to organizing for the first place in 2010. Um, um, I took my first course in organizing in an organizing workshop that was held in Damascus in Syria. I got hooked kind of. So in 2011, in 2010, the trainer said, "Oh, there's this online course that is actually taught by Marshall, um, and you might want to consider it." So I've looked at the course, and I took the course online as a student in 2011, and I've been doing organizing on and off since then. Um, but yeah, that's kind of how where the accent comes from.
Describe for me, or picture, so for those folks that aren't familiar with life in Syria, what was it like? What was your childhood experiences like growing up in that small village in southern Syria?
Um, I have to say, before I go there, I was very privileged in the way that I grew up, in the way that I was sort of like raised. It's not a representative sort of like for many of the other families or children who lived in that experience. Um, but Sueda is a small sort of like city that is in the south, and it's how How to describe it? That's a really good question. I've never actually thought of it in a way to describe it. Um, but you grew up in a way that l- I don't want to say limited with options, but you grew up in a way that you don't have plenty of opportunities to explore different things. So you grew up with almost driven pathways that you have to take or you have to go through one way or another. Um, so I remember growing up in and again I was very privileged in that situation. But I remember coming back from school. Um, my grandmother used to be a pharmacist. So I would go to her pharmacy and sort of like just sit there and watch her, you know, dealing with customers. Or and in those moments where she doesn't have a customer, she would um, there was a back sort of like back room in the pharmacy where she would mix medication or sort of like prepare prescriptions, where I would literally go and sit with her and just listen to her stories.
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, she taught me chess. She taught me English. So my memories of my childhood growing up in that city is full of those kind of moments where I would just go after school almost every day, where she would be telling me stories. Both of my parents worked two jobs um, to make ends meet. My brother actually, when he was born, we had almost a small room with a bed in the shops that where he like slept and stayed. And so for the first couple of years of his life, I don't think he knows that we had a house, because he would wake up in the shops and then sleep in the shops as a child. Um, but that was the sort of like the type of childhood. So I think again I was very privileged that I grew up in surrounded by family, and surrounded by stories of my grandmother, who I th- I believe she had sort of massive impact on my life and inspiration of why I went into organizing. So one of the things that she used to tell me is how she studied to become a pharmacist at a time where women at that time wasn't necessarily expected to achieve, and certainly did not have the opportunities as others around the world. So she was married when she was 16. My grandfather loved her, but he wanted a housewife. He was this big sort of like military guy in the government. Um, and he wanted a housewife. He didn't want a sort of like an but she decided to study, and she decided to go to and to become a pharmacist and open her own pharmacy, and that's in the 1960s.
Mm.
Um, so her story of sort of that fight, I think, had massive influence on um, why I looked into that kind of wanting to volunteer or wanting to engage in any uh, um, work, community work. But as I mentioned before, and Stephen, if I'm going on a tangent, please stop me.
No, keep going. I had lots of questions, but I'm going to wait for a break and then I'm going to jump in. Yeah, but keep going.
um, but I think that's where I kind of like started thinking of actually would like to enjoy, or I would like to do something within the community. And as I've mentioned before, there are certain pathways. So at that time, the only voluntary space was um, the Syrian Red Crescent, which is the equivalent of the Red Cross and part of the sort of like the international Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. But I went there, I volunteered there, and it was it's a it's a space or a place where I spent almost 12 years as a volunteer in volunteering there. Many of my friends today are come from that back kind of like that space, or and certainly many of my beliefs come from that space. So it was a place where I've grown as a person, and I've seen my values develop and evolve, and um, in so many different ways.
Was it
Uh,
the fact that your grandmother was essentially working as a healthcare provider that did you make the link from that? Like, it was the experience of hanging out in the back of the shop, which seemed to be like a learning center unto itself for you, that led you to think, well, how do I make a contribution? Is the Red Crescent was that natural thing, or was that completely disconnected?
it was almost the only thing available. So it wasn't so the because of the authoritarian nature of the regime in Syria, you don't have many venues for volunteering. Certainly not in a city like Sueda, which is even considered sort of like smaller uh, um, than the rest of the cities of Syria. So it wasn't the link wasn't the health link. It was more um, the wanting to volunteer, wanting to do something.
Yeah, right. How old were you when you first went and volunteered with the Red Crescent?
I think maybe 13, 14 years old.
Right. And were other kids doing that same thing, or were you a bit of an outlier?
Um, we were, it was four or five of us who were at a similar age, and everyone else was slightly getting older and older. So it wasn't necessarily something that is specifically for kids at that age. It was more, and it's funny when you say kids, I was like, I wasn't a kid, but I was. So, um, but the truth is that so I've ended up sort of like bringing a couple of my friends actually to join because I've experienced that venue. But it wasn't specifically designed to. So at that time, we didn't have scouts, and I don't think there are scouts so there wasn't any space for you to, as a teenager, to go into those spaces or to go into those. It was the only space that you could technically go to. Um, but it was an amazing space. It
What,
wasn't though
why
enough.
was it? Why was it an amazing space?
So in again, we're talking within the context of that people were not necessarily. It was actually illegal to, and still is illegal to meet in groups, right? Not that it was enforced, so people were kind of, the police or security forces looked at the other way around, but you're living in the shadow of just the fact that you're meeting other people is something that is not completely okay.
Yeah.
So the fact to see a group of 30 young people all in a room thinking about um, first aid training or disaster management training, or talking about values, talking about um, how they want to help their community. For me, was a great exposure at that time as a teenager, and certainly did not make my teenagehood sort of a typical one, if you want.
Yeah. Is it worth giving some context to the audience listening to the show today to understand what the politics of Syria was like at that time? Because you've alluded to it a little bit, but like the notion of civil rights afforded to citizens, or the lack of civil rights afforded to citizens.
Yeah.
What's life like for a punter living in Syria at that time? What can and can't you do?
Um, I can describe it in more of instances, that like images. Again, I was experiencing that as a child. Again, I wasn't experiencing that as a. So it's not more. It's less of an analytical mind, but it's more about. I'm. So one instance, I remember that you're like, people used to say all the time, "Be careful, walls have ears." So that was a kind of like a sentence that's said often and often, and it says something that you can say and see all the time. Um, or Another sent, and I don't know how sweary your
Go for it.
the program is, but people used to say this person has, has big testicles, to mean that they are connected to the security forces,
Right.
right? Or like they have connections. So they would say, "Oh, you need someone with big testicles to help you with that, right? Big testes or something." So that used to be kind of like sentences. So as a sort of like as a teenager, as a child in that time, you would sort of like see those things. Another sort of like image, and that was probably early 90s. I remember that my parents would send me to the shops to buy certain things. Um, and I remember going into one of the shops and saying, "Oh, have you got a couple of cans of tuna?" And the shopkeeper literally just saying, like shushing his mouth, because at that time tuna was not allowed to be sold in shops, and there were other customers, so he was basically
Right.
smuggling tuna cans into the place. um and obviously he was sort of like worried that, because I've asked him that question publicly, that other customers might tell about him. um or you hear about, someone who said something and then they disappeared, in that sense.
How did that make you feel when you hear these things? Like even in this situation in the grocery store when the guy said, shush about the tuna. Like you, as a young person, do you have a notion of concern about that, or that's not right, or if someone has gone missing? I mean, that's pretty huge, right?
It is. I mean, again, retrospectively, I've realized that all retrospectively, not in the time. Um, because at that time I wasn't like, I was like, oh yeah, he doesn't want me to speak about this in public, and that's how it is. So I didn't have at that time the tools to look at this from a different perspective, in a way. It looked more of, this is how life is. I only started thinking of those instances later on in life. Um, and again, I went to schools where we had to wear military uniforms in schools, and that was everyone. That wasn't sort of like my school. So, but we used to have like lessons about how to use guns and rifles and stuff in schools when I was eighth grade, which is what, 14 years old, and so you grew up in this sort of like almost a military controlled environment, to a degree. But again, at that time, that was how it is. There wasn't anything different to say, oh, actually, it's different than this. Um, and I've only started realizing that at much older age.
Your time with the Red Crescent, and later on we'll talk about leadership as a practice. But I'm wondering, were there people who held leadership positions within the Red Crescent that you were exposed to that helped shape who you are, in terms of,
Mm,
you mentioned before about your values, part of your values were formed whilst
mm.
being involved in Red Crescent. What moments were those values formed, and was it through particular people?
There were certainly there were a lot of people who were there, and later on when the uprising started in 2011, you could see almost the people who volunteered within the Red Crescent, sort of like almost s- went into two groups: those who managed to keep their neutrality as the core value of the Red Crescent stayed, and those who felt that they needed to take a political stand, which I was one of them, and who had to kind of like leave, and so there were almost two groups that came out. But I think my leadership was formed from both kind of like groups or camps, if you want.
Mm.
Um, and there were certainly many learning opportunities and growth opportunities as I think I was talking about the exposure before. I think that's where my exposure really started. So you get the simplest exposure is that being a volunteer there took me outside of my city into meeting volunteers from different cities, different backgrounds. Again, you're talking in a country that is. So I come from a small, or my family is a small religious minority within the big the country, and there is always this history of fear that is spoken of about oh, if you say things like this, or if you're identified as this, or if you're identified as that, people would look down on you and or look differently at you, or um, and then suddenly you actually meet other people and interact with other people, and they don't do that. And there's that kind of like underlying shared values that makes everyone sort of like just equal. So that was my first exposure to break some of those cultural beliefs, and certainly beliefs that were enforced and still enforced by the regime at the moment.
Because Syria is a reasonably multicultural, diverse nation, right? Isn't that one of the challenges of it?
It
Is that
is,
it was kind
yeah,
of when the map was drawn, it was they were just trying to get a whole bunch of people to may not align with one another, and that's probably one of what we would regard in the West as a strength of a community, but also creates great tension as well.
yeah.
What did you learn from being exposed to different people from different backgrounds?
So the you're absolutely right, and I think you need also kind of as a for the context of that those lines of division were enforced by the regime in Syria.
You're right.
So another thing is that although on the face of it, you don't see any of that being present. You don't see that in documents. You don't see that in different places. However, we always knew that you could reach certain positions in the army if you are of a certain background. You can reach certain positions in the security forces if you are of a specific background. So there is always this unspoken, implicit set of rules that was enforced quite heavily by. So those lines of divisions are not are not necessarily unique to the situation in Syria, but they were enforced and sort of like engineered in a way to benefit the people in the power. But the first exposure was basically in the sense that these lines of divisions are what I'm describing now, as in like lines of divisions that they are superficial
Yeah.
and and not necessarily right. So um, which then when you have a friend from a different background and someone you have you to me it was that moment of, so I remember a friend who's saying, you know, oh, people from this background is X, Y, and Z. And I remember saying, actually, not. I've got a couple of friends who I know very well. So it simply immunizes you almost against those stereotypes just by having interacted with people. And I think that was my biggest, or one of my biggest lessons that I've learned. That it's exposed me uh, uh, um, to this different way of looking at things.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energize the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. I want to ask you questions about the pro-democracy movement and your
Mm.
place within it. But before we do that, can you talk about key moments that sparked this, I don't want to say insurgency, but this movement, I guess, in amongst the Syrian community to sort of say basically start to speak out against the Assad regime? And where did what was going on at the time in Syria that led to this?
So that was happening within the background of the Arab Spring.
So what are
So
we
in,
talking,
in
2010, 2011? Was that?
20, it's, yes, something 29, 2010, where movements, like the Tunisian sort of managed to overthrow their president. Um, Egypt was going on or has gone on. So different countries who've done this movement, and um, Syrians still talk today about when did it actually start, and I don't think like a specific starting date. It's more of people acted, but I think what the Arab Spring brought this Syrian generation is hope.
Mm.
Is that actually we've seen other examples of what we thought at the time as uh, um, similar dictatorships that can be actually changed. Um, so it gave hope, and there were small movements left and right, and the one of the main stories that is told about is about the children who in Daraa, which is another city in Syria, wrote on like they've graffitied basically or wrote on walls, um, "It's your turn," and they meant the president Bashar at the time, um, and the response was brutal. So the security forces took the children, sort of like tortured them, and then kind of like disrespected everything else, which is even sparked even further anger. Um, but it was always boiling under the surface.
Hmm.
Um, because the fact is that as a young person at that time, you don't have many options. Your options are really limited. So you you've either had to travel away, work abroad, and then bring in money, or you've got to just go through what everyone else is going through at that time, which wasn't a very good life or a very good options. So always people always felt that there is this something boiling under the surface and just waiting to. So I think the Arab Spring gave that hope, and one by one incident sort of like created that initial spark that launched the whole thing.
How did,
Um,
how did you come to find yourself involved in it?
uh, it took me a little bit.
How old were you at the time while this was happening? And what were you doing?
Um, I was just finishing my master's at uni. How old was I? I don't know, Stephen. I need to do some calculations. I'm 38 now. So go back. I think 20, what, 24?
Yeah.
Maybe? Yeah. Um, at that time. And just before that, I was joining different trainings for well, actually that was the first organizing training that happened even before that. So the organizing training
I
happened
didn't know that.
in 2010 before the uprising started, before anything started. There
Ah,
was other like I remember in one of those trainings we finished the training, and there was like we were watching the news about what's happening in Egypt. But that was it. And then we finished the training. Out of the training, we were thinking, actually, things are happening around us. But me and another friend from the training, we were saying, this is something that we could actually, you know, take on forward. But we weren't thinking of it in terms of regime change or any of that. It was more in terms of kind of like, so people at that time always thought Bashar is the good guy, but he's surrounded by the old guards. So they would say, especially kind of like, they would say, they always looked at him as, and certainly I did as well at the time, as the guy who might be leading that change. So that's why when the incident in Dar'a happened, people were kind of like shocked and disappointed in a way, because they went to him to as they saw him the progressive person who actually created some changes since he came into power in 2000. Um, then then there was another sort of like a promise of a big speech to take place, and then he came to this. He basically spoke and said literally nothing. He gave um, no indication to doing anything. So people got even more and more sort of like fed up with that. But at the beginning, it certainly looked at him as the person who might be leading that change. Um, so the training happened. We looked at kind of like launching different campaigns, and one of the campaigns we were thinking of is the parliamentarian campaign. And when I joined the course, LOA course in 2011, that was my project. And I guess we're going to talk a little bit about the course later on, but that was kind of like the project that I was hoping. But at the same time, um, the parliamentarian election kept being pushed and pushed because of the situation boiling more and more
Mm.
in Syria, and um, it really clearly became quite fast. Clearly, it became clear that it's not the parliament is not the place to create any of that change, and that a change within the available channels is not going to be a real change. So many of the organizers within the campaign started sort of like just simply drifting away and doing their own things, and it almost became um, they just joined whatever is happening, taking place under the radar, basically.
What change did you want to see at that time?
Um, I'm trying to remember. We had three we within the campaign we had three values that we wanted to see. It was I remember freedom and dignity of them. So we wanted, and justice. That was those are the three. So it was freedom, justice, and dignity that we kind of like we wanted. So those are the three main values that we were hoping um to start. Again, that's looking back at it, it feels so naive that we thought we could, change the world.
Mm.
Um, but we hope that small bit we were kind of like it will start creating that enough momentum to create, and that was happening completely again within the context of there is nothing's happening in Syria at the time, so we were evolving in that sense, and that Bashar is going to be leading that change.
Mm.
So we didn't see or say that kind of like but it was that kind of within that context of is that yeah, the Bashar is the good guy, but he's surrounded by many bad old guards.
Was the speech that he made that he said where your expectations were that he would say something that would redirect the direction of the country, but he said nothing? Is that the moment where you lost faith, or were there other moments?
I think it was more of a cumulative sort of like things that happened one after the other. It wasn't a one thing that took place. Um, And at that time, there were still you started to see and hear horror stories of what's happening in other places, and you kind of like wonder, even if he's leading that change, is he not able to prevent that change, that those things from happening? And if he's not, then maybe he's not. So it took me a while to, and I think it's those small sort of like cumulative
Mm.
moments that you hear and you see, and then against the reality of what's happening, um, that kind of like breaks. But I would say that that broke quite early on. So but it was cumulative moments.
I have memories of watching the news of an evening and just seeing thousands of people in Damascus protesting in the streets. Uh, and then maybe as quickly as a week later, it just all of a sudden just flipped. And I'm really testing my memory here, but I felt like that like there was sort of there was troops on the streets and this sort of people protest. It turned nasty and quickly. Like what take us to those that am I right in my recollections there?
It's yes, and I mean it's always been yes, and people were getting shot at. And I've got friends who I knew very well who've got really, really close to being either shot or being chased. And I certainly remember running away from certain demonstrations because we've
Mm,
heard gunshots. And you don't know, if you're in a demonstration, you don't know if these bullets are being shot in the air or at the front rows.
mm,
So the people who were in the front rows are always the people who have been kind of like the most courageous ones.
hmm,
So you'd go into kind of like into the demonstrations and covering your face because other people would take videos of who's in the demonstrations. So probably you'd seen a lot of people covering their faces for that reason. Um, but again, the irony is that you can. Like, I remember going into demonstrations with a group of kind of like friends who, and you develop a different relationship with those people who you go to demonstrations with, because it's if any one of them broke, kind of like it's your, like they hold the keys to your life, basically they know who you are. And so there's a different trusting relationship that you that's I think it's what it's described as true camaraderie, I think,
mhm.
kind of like in that sense. But I
When you
remember
say broke,
going
do
into
you mean
the
if they were caught by the police or by the security forces,
yes,
they know
yes.
that if they broke in that interrogation that they would then give you up?
Exactly, and everyone breaks into in interrogations. Even it's like people break in the interrogations
Yeah.
because people are tortured to death. So you don't. It's not even assumed that you don't speak. It's assumed that of course you should speak to spare your life.
Mm,
Um, and unfortunately, even those who spoke ended up many of them ended up dying in prisons, or while in because of the inhumane conditions that people live in. So or they were kept in. Um, but then it wasn't as like any severe. But we went into demonstrations, and I remember coming back from the demonstrations, and there was like the news was at the time saying, "Oh yeah, all the demonstrators are extremist, all the demonstrators are kind of like." And I was looking at the group that we were in that demonstrations, like funny enough, laughing and saying, okay, which bar are we going to now to
mm,
have a drink after the demonstrations? um, I come from a Druze background. Two of the guys, kind of like two of the people in the group, were sort of like Christians, and it was kind of like a mixed group by itself. Um, so we were laughing at those kind of like lies in a way that it doesn't make sense. But um, and this is kind of like comes back to the divide lines that I was saying, is it kind of like it was almost. But having said that, it almost became later on, because the regime pushed so much into that, you have to be very brave to go into a demonstration.
Yeah,
It
where did you get
almost,
the courage? Where did you get the courage to do that? That's what sounds to me.
I mean, it wasn't again, it didn't require a lot of courage at that time. So at that time, it wasn't that severe. So as long as you protected your face, as long as, unless you're really unlucky, you'd not, you know. But the but later on, it became kind of very risky situation, very risky business, and certainly in different cities, depending on the city where you are, it might be riskier than other cities. Um, but that push came into the, and one of the moments that I really remember is that the demonstrations that were not protected, and when I say protected, by basically demonstrators who are holding guns, were shot at. Um, and then when, if a demonstration goes out and it had its own protection, the security forces would not shoot at. And I remember a friend saying, "Ah, this is a really shitty example,
Mm.
because now what they're modeling is, if we hold guns, they don't shoot at us, so we should hold guns." And a few months down the line, the FSA, which is the Free Syrian Army, was formed, and their main purpose at that time was protecting demonstrations.
Hmm.
Because it was the reality of it. It was the reality that if you go into a demonstration protected by the FSA, um, your life is 10 times safer. Um, but unfortunately, that played into the hand of into later on, into sort of like the different, what became the proxy war.
Yeah. How
Um,
did when did you realize it was time to get out? I don't know how to frame that
get out.
question in any other way than that, right?
Well, 2013, and again, I was very privileged in the way that I went out. So um, it was basically, I moved jobs. So I found a different job in a different place, and I moved into that job, and then which for a while in Lebanon, and then I moved to Egypt with my son and ex-wife, or wife at the time, and then moved to kind of like Jordan. So that move was prompted by what's happening, obviously, in Syria and the country, but also in a way that was very, very privileged. So an opportunity presented itself to move. Um,
But moving,
Right.
like I mean, living your home country, you were born there. Like it's your home. Like that's not an easy thing to do, right? I know. I appreciate that you're lucky that you had an opportunity to get out. Many people didn't. But even still, the decision to say, "Oh, I need to get the fuck out of Dodge here," like, when was that moment
Yeah.
that you realized that, "Oh, we can't be here anymore. It's not safe."
Um, Again, I don't think there was a moment. Um, I wonder what Marshall would say about this. But
Yeah,
anyway.
I'm thinking the same thing. Don't give me that bullshit. Of course there was a moment. There's always a moment.
um, but it was always something. It was always an idea that is evolving in the background. I think the moment was the moment I took the decision to not come back, um, and leave. And that what prompted that was the means to stay, basically. So it was that kind of moment. But it was, again, see, remember that the idea of leaving the country is an idea that you grew up with. So you always grow up thinking, if you want to make anything for yourself, you can't make it in this place.
Hmm.
So most of my kind of like generation and the older generation, it was kind of like almost given that you finish university and then you go and find a job in one of the Gulf countries. The previous generation, you grew up and then you go and travel to Latin America, South America to basically do some to work there. So the idea of finishing university and leaving, that was the by almost the default idea to do if you want to make something for yourself or if you have the means. And you can always almost see that certain cities travel to certain sort of like certain they've got their connections in certain countries. So it wasn't a foreign idea completely to actually, oh, I found a job, let's move. It was almost kind of like, of course you found a job, of course you move. So it wasn't that kind of big disconnection, if you want.
But the fact that you couldn't return.
Yes. So yeah. And again, the country, as it continues to change, it became more and more different to how I remember. So even with the ability to return, I don't know if that's the place where if how it's going to look like. When when you remember things, you always remember them differently. Um, so the changes later on became much, much, much harder, and much more severe, um, to make it a little bit more, yeah.
Do you, I mean, technically that civil war hasn't ended, but in that period from when we're talking to now, like over 500,000 people have died. Like your hometown, do you know what state it's in now? Your friends that you spent in the Red Crescent, where are they? What are they doing? Like,
Yeah.
what kind of connection do you have to that? Yeah.
So hometown is spared in a way because of again that small minority kind of element of it, and they managed um to stay in that space where they got spared the brutality of the regime.
Mm-hmm.
However, with I don't know if you've heard the news recently. Last year, there were a lot of demonstrations that are starting in Syria, and it was the significance of it is that this is one of the smallest minority in Syria that is speaking against the regime. Um, but still, the regime did not respond as severely to it because of again my thinking. I think it didn't respond because again, one of their main arguments is that without us as a regime, the majority will just eliminate all the minorities.
Mm.
So they couldn't be seen in that way. And for the past few years, the regime been managing the city in through militias. So they wouldn't intervene directly, but they will be supporting different militias, that are sort of like taking hold and control. And people again responded to that and took hold. So there has been really positive, strong changes that's taking place there. But it's the hometown has been always sort of like been managed in that sense. Um, Friends, I don't know any of them who's still in Serbia. I think maybe one or two. Everyone else is out.
Mm.
Um, yeah. So it's becoming. I don't know if I maybe know one or two people who are still inside, but everyone else is out.
And now you live in Scotland.
I do live in Scotland. Yes, of all places.
I, the concept of identity is something that's always something I found interesting. My parents are Scottish. My grandparents are Irish. I'm Australian. Who the hell am I? Australia's a reasonably multicultural country. Who the hell are we? We're a new country. That kind of stuff. You're born in Syria. You speak multiple different languages. You now live in Scotland. How do you ground yourself? What is your identity? Do you feel like you're like a Syrian that's living overseas, and that's how do you describe yourself?
That's a
International
tough
man of
question.
mystery.
Right. That's a tough question for sure. Um, that's a really tough question. I think I don't, the way I think of it is and potentially, again, it is because of my experience within the Red Cross and Red Crescent, that there is the value thread. That's what that was really, really see it as the main thing. So I don't necessarily see identities in that sense. It's
Yeah.
more of, um, there are certain people are people, like,
Yeah.
in its simplest form, as people are people. There are certain cultural aspects that I like about every place I visited, or every place I've sort of like enjoyed. Um, and I enjoy them, kind of like in a way that is very, um, so it's not all or nothing kind of deal. For me, I think I learned to almost pick and choose certain things that I am proud of or I enjoy from um, different places I've been to, more than sort of like different. I was born and raised in Syria by chance,
Mm.
but I am particularly proud of the Syrian cuisine and the food, and I consider it to be the best. Right, like there is nothing that can top that. I think that's my only hard line. Other than that, everything is up to for negotiations and convincing.
You definitely made that very
Uh,
clear to some of it, maybe one of our Egyptian colleagues in our class this year that there was some debates about what is the best Arab food. But yes, you were very
yes,
clear on that.
exactly.
Or Middle
Yes,
Eastern food, I should
definitely.
say. I should say.
um, and remember that I am half Egyptian as well, so
That
I can
is,
speak for
yeah.
both.
Um,
uh, mm,
so there's, I mean, one of the things I do love about the global organizing community is that it brings people and their lived experiences from all around the world, and they come together and they are united in these values that you're talking about. And there might be a good segue to talk about the Leadership Organizing and Action class in which you are the head teaching fellow.
mm.
Um, I'm just wondering, do I want to ask you questions about the course first, or do I want to ask you questions about your expectations when you went in to do the class in the first instance? Maybe that. Why did you sign up for Why did you sign up to do the Leadership Organizing and Action class with Marshall?
In 2011, it was more of to learn what we wanted to learn at that time. So within the workshop, Nasreen Haj Ahmed, who you might know as well, actually, was the main trainer. And through the course, she mentioned, I've learned these through working with Professor Marshall Ganz, and these are the practices. And by the way, he has his online course that is, he provides, and you can learn from him. So in that moment, I wanted to learn more about it. So I was kind of like, yeah, I'll sign up for it. And it was an extortionate amount of money for me. Like I had think I and it's think I had to pay maybe $1,500, which is at that time for someone who's living in Syria is really, really expensive. Like that's really, really expensive. So I had to sort of like borrow some money and then go through the course. But I wanted to go through it. I wanted to make sure that I kind of like pay for the course and go through the course, um, which was a really kind of like great learning opportunity for me, because it exposed me more in depth into the practices, um, um, and it exposed me into this global, as you describe it, global community of organizers. So I was working on something, but there were a lot of other people working on so many different projects or campaigns that also contributed to my learning in different ways. Um, so in 2011, we kind of like me and the other friend who were leading the campaign. or part of the campaign, we're transferring this knowledge to the rest of our group. And we were sort of like training the other organizers with us. So we would take the lectures or take the practices and then try and transfer them to other organizers on the ground. Um, and it was really helpful because then you go through something and you go back to your TF or back to Marshall and say, actually, we've tried this and it didn't really work. Um, how should we do it? Or this doesn't really work in our situation because you can't go and knock on people's doors. They will freak out. You will freak out. They will call the security forces on you. What should we do? So stuff like this. So that's kind of like the reason. So the reason going there is that I had the campaign. I needed more information. I needed more than a 2 or 3 day training. I needed that kind of scaffolding throughout because the course is not as compressed as a workshop, right? So it's like it extends on over like 2 or 3 months, um, which you need if you're doing something. You need those kind of like I tried something, I come back and ask. I tried something, I come back and ask. So that was a kind of like the deal with it.
What is the? I've talked about this in the show before, but I'm keen to hear it from you as well. What is the central when you talk about leadership as a practice? What do you mean by that? What do we mean by that?
So the idea of it is that you're not we're not looking for a charismatic leader, right? You're not looking for the one who you're looking for a leader who mainly is interested in developing other people's leadership as well. So you're looking for someone who is invested in building relationships with people, who see um, who see people for who they are and work with them to build that capacity, to build that leadership, to build that um, and that's the leadership model that we kind of like we look at it as in we take something and then we we learn from what we're doing and then we always come back, reflect and get better at it. um but so that's kind of like so the definition of a leadership, which I kind of it's basically that definition of supporting or empowering people in times of uncertainty, because that's where we kind of like work with in that space. um I don't know if I answered your question, Stephen,
No,
there.
you did. I mean, because we talk about practice. I mean, I guess that word practice can be have many different definitions, and I think that the thing that I learned from when I did leadership organizing and action was that I hadn't realized that leadership is a practice that we have to continue to work at it. No one masters the craft of leadership. That was a key learning for me. And obviously this practice has stepped out in 5 different particular practices
Yeah.
or frameworks: narrative, relationship building, strategy, structure, and action. But to practice it and to continue to practice it was something that I was like, right, I've done the course, but I'm now not going to be the master of it. I have to continue to practice this work. And that was a huge takeaway for me when I did do the class with Marshall.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that why the reflection is a really important practice, because without it you're missing that learning element, you're missing that development, or you're missing that kind of learning from what you're doing. um, and that's where even reflection, as you I'm sure you know, reflection papers on almost every time you've done something is part of the course, because otherwise you're not you're missing on that learning.
Who's the kind of person that should, if they're interested in signing up for this class, who are we looking for? Who's going to get some benefit out of this?
Someone who is doing something or willing to do something with people, someone who's either in a campaign or thinking to launch a campaign. When I joined the course, I was starting to think of launching the campaign. So we had initial ideas, but we needed that help, right? Um, and when I say a campaign, I mean a campaign, a community organizing campaign, a campaign that involves people. And it involves people as, again, within the leadership definition that we talk about. So it's not involving, it's not a media campaign. It's not an awareness campaign. We're looking at a campaign that you want to grow and work with more and more people, leadership, and so if you're in that space, you're a great candidate for this, and you'll fully benefit from this course. Yeah.
And how do folks apply for this course? Like when does applications close? When does the course run? Like, just gives the logistics of it.
So the best way the only way to apply basically is just to go to the course website, and you can search it on Google, Leadership, Organizing, and Action, and it's from as you've mentioned earlier, from Harvard Kennedy School, the exec education part.
We'll put the
You
link
can apply.
we'll put the link to the application form in the notes for today's episode as well, by the way, just so you can click on that too.
Brilliant, thank you. The course itself runs from 5th of February until end of May. So that's kind of like the time frame. It's around 15 weeks. The deadline, the application is coming soon. So the application is 8th of December deadline. So that's sort of like in a soonish time, couple of 3 weeks maybe. And the course kind of like structure is run that you've got you've got 4 items if you want within this course. You've got the lecture, which is with Marshall. You've got the section meeting, which is with your TF, and that means around each section consists of around 20 participants within this course, and you get to meet your TF or teaching fellow. Your TF is an organizer like yourself, Stephen, who's joined us last year. And it's the idea is that you're being supported, or the participants are being supported by an organizer who has some experience from the ground. They will never have all the answers, and but they're great at asking questions, right? Which is the third element of the course, where we talk about the reflection papers and the reflection element of the course. So the course will prompt and will push you to reflect more and more, which is the third element. And the fourth is a skill practice assignments, where you get to meet another 2 fellow participants within your section, and then you reflect and practice those practices that you're learning in class over and over. So the course itself is built into the idea of head, heart, and hands. So we're always practicing those 3 things, and we're reflecting on them and then repeat. There's lots of reading and resources available on. So usually before every lecture, we ask people to read sort of like certain list of required readings. You go into the lecture, you finish it, you go into the section meeting on the same week, then you write a reflection paper, and then you do a skill practice assignment. And that's almost a standard module, if you want.
And you need a project as well. That's really important. And for those who are going to apply, you need to have a campaign and it doesn't have to be, well, I'll let you explain it, but you need a campaign to come into this work, right?
Exactly right. The best learning happens, as you've mentioned, is in practice, right? Like while you're practicing it. So the ideal candidate, if you want, would be someone, or participant would be someone who learns from Marshall how to do one-on-ones, and then practice it with their skill practice assignment, kind of like group with their TFs, but also goes on the ground, holds five one-on-ones, and then comes back and write a reflection paper, right? So, or comes back and get to their TF and say, actually, I've done those, but in reality, we jumped between those 5 steps of one-on-one back and forth. They don't happen in order in reality, and that's the learning that we're looking for. So we're looking for participants who are willing to, or within the campaigns that are doing the work that we're doing. We talk about leadership teams, and we say in leadership teams, we want to put an agenda. How does it look like? How much time does it take to put an actual agenda, to create norms with your team, create a bounded, stable, or real team? And the idea of it is that if you're in a stage in your campaign that you're actually practicing those, um, it will make the learning 10 times better. So that's why even through the application, we ask people, what's your project? What's your campaign that you're planning to go through this learning experiment, learning journey with?
And can I say, as a student, when I did do the course, you mentioned the teams part, I literally launched my team a week after we introduced the practice of structuring teams, and it was a huge learning. I can't even begin to describe. Like, it is a seminal moment in my organizing career. Was to the very first day I launched my team, shitting myself, thinking this is not going to work. This is just, self-doubt crept in, and it was. Anyway, it was a great success, and I remember coming back into my reflection paper and going, "Oh my God, why did I not do this course 10 years earlier as a union organizer? I feel like an idiot." It was great.
Great. Yeah. That's good. That's good. But yeah, that's exactly what we're kind of, that's the hope kind of like from the learning, because I think you get the most out of it doing this while you're in the course.
Absolutely. Now, just one thing I need to tell the Australians that might be listening to this: the lectures are at not a great time because they're Boston time. So for any Aussies listening to this who are interested in applying, and I do recommend that you do, any organisers out there that are interested in doing this, you should do this course. But I need to warn you, they're at the start of the semester. They start around about 2 a.m. and they get better. It's like a midnight lecture in the second half of the semester. So it is, and they're compulsory. You must attend. You can't just watch the recordings. You actually have to show up. And I can tell you, as a teaching fellow myself, I look and make sure that you attend. We do. It's not like, we hold you to it anyway. So just there's a disclaimer. You must need to know that the times are challenging. The rest of it's not bad,
Yeah.
but the lectures are tough.
Yes. Unless Marshall decides to move to Australia at one point and then does the course from there, maybe the rest of the world can see how much how much that takes.
I'll have to run a campaign to get Marshall to immigrate to Australia, and see if we can turn that around for us, perhaps. But until then, no, we're just going to have to suck it up. It's a small price to pay, because I actually, in all honesty, in all seriousness, there are people who are in that course that are in coming to it from far more challenging circumstances than just time zones. And that's a very grounding experience as a student from a privileged background, to learn that people are like yourself when you did it, Ashraf. Some people are putting themselves in danger from doing this work. So that's a very rich learning for us when we do this class. It's another thing. It's a byproduct you don't think about at the time, but when you do the class, you're like, oh wow, okay, this is quite an inspirational global community that we're a part of.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's brilliant.
As I said before, we're going to put the links to to apply for the course in the show notes. We really encourage you to do that. Ashraf, thank you so much for coming on the show, and first of all, just sharing your experiences growing up in Syria. I really did appreciate that. It was wonderful. I don't know if you're comfortable sharing those things, but it was beautiful to listen and hearing your journey to become an organizer and then the head teaching fellow at for Marshall's class, and also talking a bit about the class as well. It's been great to catch up with you again, and on a normal time zone as well.
And a normal time zone. Thank you very much for having me. And yeah, it's been a great catch up this morning for me. So I'm sure it's the end of the day for you as well.
Indeed. All right. Best of luck, and we'll no doubt talk to you
Thank you
soon.
very much.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.